Jonathan Harper, the man the world called untouchable, the CEO who built an empire of glass towers that pierced the New York skyline, sat in his sleek office surrounded by polished steel, spotless marble, and silence broken only by the ticking of an expensive clock, a sound that usually reminded him of order, control, and progress, but today it seemed strangely loud, as if counting down to something he could not see. He adjusted his silver cufflinks, gazed out at the skyline drenched in late sunlight, and told himself that everything in his life was where it should be, every deal secured, every boardroom conquered, every competitor silenced. But beneath his calm surface, an unease gnawed at him like a shadow pressing against his chest, a warning that the power he worshipped might not protect him forever. And then suddenly the phone on his desk rang. Not the smooth tone of his assistant or the predictable buzz of investors, but a sharp trembling sound that sliced through the air like a blade, and when he answered, expecting a familiar adult voice, what came through was the soft, broken whisper of a child, fragile and uncertain, her words stumbling between sobs as she said, "Mr. Harper, your son, he's not moving." And in that instant the fortress he had built around his heart crumbled, the weight of his empire vanished, and all that remained was a father struck by terror, his breath caught, his pulse racing, his thoughts scattering like shards of broken glass, and before he could think, he was out of his chair, the leather seat spinning back, crashing to the ground with a thud he didn't hear, his hands trembling as he demanded answers from the girl who could barely speak through tears, his mind screaming questions, where, how, when, why. Yet his heart already knew that none of it mattered except reaching his boy, and he bolted from the office, marble floors echoing beneath his hurried steps, secretaries and board members staring wide-eyed as the man they thought incapable of fear looked like a storm tearing through the halls, his breath shallow, his vision blurred, his chest heavy as though every skyscraper in New York pressed down upon him. And when he reached the lobby, the revolving doors felt too slow, the air outside too thick, the city too crowded, because every second stretched into eternity, every red light mocking him, every step too far from the sun whose laughter was the only sound that ever softened his hardened heart. And as he flung himself into his sleek car, slamming the door so hard the glass rattled, he barked the address the girl had given him, his voice breaking as the driverless engine roared to life, and the vehicle surged into the chaos of the city, weaving through lanes. But for Jonathan time didn't move, it dragged, cruel and merciless, each second stabbing deeper as images of Daniel flashed before his eyes. Daniel running in the garden with chestnut hair catching the sunlight, Daniel's hand clutching his fingers with trust, Daniel's blue eyes shining with innocence that no empire could buy. And now those eyes were closed, perhaps forever, and Jonathan gripped the leather seat until his knuckles turned white, whispering prayers he hadn't spoken in years, promises he had never made to anyone but now poured into the silence. "Hold on, son, hold on, I'm coming." His voice hoarse, broken, desperate, and the car sped through intersections, horns blaring, pedestrians scattering, but Jonathan didn't care if the city burned behind him, he only cared about the fragile heartbeat of a boy who carried his soul, and as the skyline blurred past his window, the man who once believed money could command the world realized with crushing clarity that all his billions meant nothing if he couldn't hold his son again, nothing if the laughter that once filled his mansion was replaced by silence, nothing if the future he imagined vanished in the blink of an eye. And so he sat there, a billionaire stripped of power, a father drowning in fear, a man racing not toward a business deal but toward the one truth he could not negotiate with, life or death. And though the city roared around him, Jonathan Harper heard only the echo of a trembling child's voice repeating in his ears, "He's not moving." A phrase that felt like a knife twisting deeper, pushing him forward faster, because in that moment, the world's most powerful CEO was not chasing profits, not guarding his empire, but running against time, begging fate to let him arrive before it was too late. The car skidded to a violent halt, tires screeching against the asphalt, the sharp sound echoing through the crowded street as Jonathan flung the door open before the vehicle had even stopped fully, his body propelled by panic rather than reason, his expensive shoes slamming against the pavement as he sprinted toward the gathering of bystanders who parted instinctively, their murmurs fading into a blur as his eyes locked on the sight that ripped the breath from his lungs. His son Daniel sprawled motionless on the unforgiving concrete, his small chest rising only faintly, as if each breath fought through unseen chains, his hair messy, his shirt dirtied, his face pale in a way no father should ever have to witness, and beside him, kneeling with trembling knees pressed into the gritty street, was a little blonde-haired girl whose cheeks glistened with trails of tears, her tiny hands hovering just above Daniel's still frame as though she desperately wanted to save him, but lacked the strength to do anything more than whisper. I tried to wake him, but he wouldn't open his eyes. Her voice cracked like fragile glass, carrying both fear and innocence, and in that instant, Jonathan's heart fractured into 1,000 jagged pieces, his knees crashing to the ground so hard he didn't feel the sting of rough gravel biting through his tailored suit. How bow! His trembling hands reaching for Daniel's small fingers, clutching them desperately as if through sheer will, he could transfer life back into his boy, his voice breaking into raw pleading that silenced the crowd. Stay with me, son. Please, stay with me. Don't leave me. Not like this. And the weight of those words hung heavy in the air, a father stripped bare, his empire meaningless before the fragile body of his child, while the little girl, still on her knees, looked at him with wide, fearful eyes that seemed to carry both sorrow and courage, her small frame shaking but refusing to move, her lips quivering as though she felt responsible for holding a secret too big for her age, and Jonathan, glancing at her for just a second, felt a flicker of something strange. A sense that this child was not just a stranger, but somehow tied to this moment in a way he couldn't understand. Yet there was no time to question, no time to breathe, only time to fight the rising terror that Daniel's chest might stop moving altogether. And so Jonathan pressed his ear close to his son's lips, desperate for the faintest whisper of air, and when he felt the fragile, shallow breath, relief and agony collided within him, tears burning behind his eyes but refusing to fall, because a man who once commanded the world now found himself powerless, begging for one more heartbeat, one more second, one more chance. And the little girl, gathering every ounce of courage, reached out to touch Daniel's shoulder gently, whispering, "Please wake up, please don't leave." Her tone so pure it cracked something deeper in Jonathan, who lifted his gaze to the heavens above the towering buildings and silently cursed the cruel twist of fate that placed his son's life on the edge of darkness in the middle of a crowded street, while the world around him blurred, the sounds of honking cars, shuffling shoes and murmuring, "Gee, strangers," fading into nothing but the pounding of his heart and the fragile rhythm of Daniel's breath. And as Jonathan cradled his son's hand tighter, his soul trembling, he realized that the bravest person in that moment wasn't the billionaire father who could command armies of lawyers and investors, but the small, tear-streaked girl who stayed, when running would have been easier, her presence a fragile flame of hope in a night of fear. And though Jonathan didn't yet understand why she hadn't left, why she called him, why she clung to Daniel's side as if guarding him from the world, he knew one truth. This child's bravery had given him a chance to kneel here, to whisper to his son, to hope against despair. And as sirens finally wailed faintly in the distance, growing louder with every passing second, Jonathan bowed his head against Daniel's chest, whispering, "Hold on, my boy. I'm right here. I won't let go." His tears finally spilling onto the dusty pavement, mingling with the innocent tears of a little girl whose presence had just begun to weave itself into the very fabric of his broken heart. Jonathan felt the fragile weight of Daniel in his arms, every breath shallow and uneven against his chest, and though his body was strong, carrying him felt heavier than all the skyscrapers he had ever built, his legs burning as he ran toward the car that still sat idling in the chaos of the street, his voice hoarse as he shouted at the system to reroute instantly to the nearest hospital, his own pulse racing faster than the speeding vehicle that surged forward like a bullet through the veins of New York, red lights ignored, horns blaring, pedestrians scattering, yet all Jonathan saw was his son's pale face pressed against his shoulder, each second dragging like eternity as he whispered broken pleas into Daniel's ear, promises that if he held on, if he kept breathing, nothing would ever matter more than him, not meetings, not fortunes, not deals. And the little blonde-haired girl, fragile yet unyielding, clutched the seat beside him, her wide eyes locked on Daniel, refusing to blink as though by watching she could will him to live, her silence heavier than words, her small fingers gripping the edge of the seat so tightly, her knuckles turned white, and when the car screeched to a halt outside the glowing red emergency entrance, Jonathan bolted through the doors with Daniel cradled in his arms, shouting for help with a voice that cracked through the sterile air like thunder, his authority not as a CEO, but as a father desperate to bargain with fate. Doctors and nurses rushing forward, hands pulling his son from his embrace, wires and monitors quickly surrounding the small, fragile body as they wheeled him away through swinging double doors that slammed shut between Jonathan and his child, leaving him standing frozen, his hands empty for the first time, his body trembling as though part of him had been carried away on that stretcher, and the weight of helplessness crushed him harder than any corporate failure ever could, his knees threatening to buckle as the world that once bent to his commands now mocked him with its indifference, and the girl who had followed silently all the way, tugged at the sleeve of his expensive suit, her small voice quivering, Will he be okay?" And Jonathan, turning to meet her gaze, saw eyes so pure, so filled with a strange mixture of terror and hope, eyes that did not belong to a stranger but seemed to pierce something unguarded inside him, and though his own chest burned with fear, though his throat tightened around words that wanted to shatter into sobs, he forced himself to kneel slightly to meet her eye level, his hand trembling as it rested on her shoulder, his whisper rough and unsteady. "He has to be. He's my whole world," and for the first time in his life, those words weren't an expression of power, not a metaphor, but the truest confession he had ever spoken, and as he said them, a tear finally escaped, rolling down the hard lines of a face the world believed incapable of breaking, falling to the sterile floor where it disappeared unnoticed, yet in that fragile moment, the billionaire who once thought himself untouchable stood exposed, and the little girl, seeing his pain, didn't step back or turn away, but instead, with a bravery far greater than her years, reached for his hand and held it, her tiny fingers wrapping around his trembling palm as though to anchor him to hope. And though Jonathan didn't understand why her touch felt oddly familiar, why her presence seemed woven into this nightmarish moment, he didn't pull away because for the first time since the call shattered his world, he realized he wasn't entirely alone in the storm. There was this child, a stranger yet not, standing beside him, carrying a courage that quietly matched his breaking heart, and as the red light above the emergency doors flickered, signaling that somewhere beyond them doctors fought for Daniel's fragile breath, Jonathan clung to the fragile hand of a little girl who refused to let go. Jonathan sat slumped in the stiff hospital chair, his tailored suit wrinkled and his tie loosened, yet for the first time in his life he didn't care about appearances. His eyes, red-rimmed and heavy with exhaustion, stayed fixed on the fragile rise and fall of Daniel's chest as the monitors beeped steadily, a sound that felt like the only thread holding his sanity together, and beside him sat the little girl, no longer trembling but curled into herself, small hands clinging to the oversized blanket he had draped around her, as though it were a lifeline. The silence stretched between them until Jonathan finally broke it, his voice hoarse and unsteady. "You never left his side. Why?" And her blue eyes, shimmering with unshed tears, lifted to his with a flicker of pain before she whispered, "Because no one ever stays for me, so I stayed for him." Words so simple yet so devastating they made his chest tighten as though an invisible hand had gripped his heart. Leaning forward, and he asked gently, almost afraid of the answer, "Where are your parents? Who looks after you?" And the girl hesitated, biting her lip before her small voice cracked like fragile glass. I don't have anyone." And though Jonathan had weathered boardroom wars, public scandals, and hostile takeovers without flinching, those 5 words pierced him deeper than any rival could, leaving him silent, struggling to reconcile the reality of this child abandoned by the world with the steel and glass empire he had built where everything was calculated, controlled, and secure. He motioned to the nurse for a tray of food and handed it to her, watching her tiny fingers clutch the sandwich as if it were a treasure, each cautious bite breaking him further, for in those trembling hands he saw hunger that had lasted longer than a day, perhaps weeks, maybe even years, and he wondered bitterly how many times she had been overlooked by men like him, too busy counting profits to notice the small souls fading in the shadows of the city's skyscrapers. He cleared his throat, his tone soft but edged with determination. "No child should ever feel invisible." and though she said nothing, her watery eyes lingered on him as though searching for truth, as though daring him to mean those words when perhaps too many before had promised and failed. Time blurred as night thickened around the sterile hospital room, Daniel's steady breathing anchoring him to hope, while the girl curled tighter under the blanket, her hair falling like a golden curtain over her pale cheeks, her innocence and fragility a stark contrast to the hardened world outside. Jonathan's mind spiraled with questions. Who was she? Why fate had crossed her path with his tonight of all nights? And yet, beneath the confusion, a strange warmth flickered in his chest, an unfamiliar pull that told him this child wasn't simply a passerby in the hall our lives, that her presence was more than coincidence, that she was a piece of a puzzle he hadn't realized was missing. As dawn's first light broke through the hospital window, casting a golden glow over Daniel's bed, Jonathan reached out instinctively, brushing the hair from the little girl's forehead as she slept, and in that quiet moment, the billionaire who had once thought himself untouchable felt something he had not in years. A connection deeper than wealth, sharper than ambition, and more haunting than any secret. For though he couldn't yet name it, he knew with a certainty that this child was tethered to his world in a way that would change everything. Jonathan found himself living inside a rhythm that no business schedule had ever prepared him for, where hours blurred not into profits or losses, but into quiet moments inside the hospital walls, and each of those moments wrapped themselves around the fragile but determined recovery of his son. Yet what astonished him more than the beeping machines or the soothing footsteps of nurses was the presence of the little girl who had appeared like a small angel at the darkest hour, and though he had first seen her as a trembling stranger with tear-streaked cheeks on a pavement stained with fear, she had since transformed into a steady companion for Daniel, a soft and constant reminder that children sometimes carry a strength adults can barely comprehend. For day after day she sat beside his son's bed with the patience of someone who had known loneliness, and had vowed never to let another child taste it, if she could help it. And when Daniel's eyelids finally fluttered open to greet the world again, the first thing he saw was not the ceiling of the recovery ward or the shadow of his father pacing restlessly, but her, the girl with golden hair and blue eyes brimming with relief, her hand gently folded around his, whispering words of comfort as though her voice alone could stitch him back together, and Jonathan, standing silently at the doorway, felt emotions crash into him with the force of an unseen storm, for he had buried tenderness after his wife's passing, covering it with the cold steel of business empires. But here in this small sterile room, tenderness rose again like sunlight breaking through the cracks of a long winter. And every time he saw Daniel smile at her silly stories, every time he heard his son laugh even through weakness, he felt pieces of his broken heart sliding into place in ways he had believed were impossible. At night when the corridors hushed and the world outside shrank to whispers of car horns and distant sirens, Jonathan often stayed longer than he intended, pretending to review documents on his phone, but really just watching how the little girl would drape a blanket over Daniel, or adjust his pillow with hands that trembled yet never faltered. And one evening, as the moonlight painted silver across the blinds, Daniel's soft whisper broke the silence. "Dad, can she stay with us? She makes me feel safe." And those words, fragile as a butterfly's wings, pierced Jonathan deeper than any negotiation or speech ever had, for they came not from logic, but from the soul of a child who had nearly been taken away. And when Jonathan's gaze met his son's, filled with hope, and then drifted toward the girl who lowered her eyes as if fearing she was unwanted, something inside him gave way, and though his throat tightened with the weight of emotions he rarely allowed himself to feel, he knelt close, brushing Daniel's hair back with trembling fingers, and whispered, "Maybe she's meant to." And those words, spoken almost unconsciously, carried a gravity he could not fully understand yet, for they were more than a promise to his son. They were an acknowledgement of the strange, undeniable pull he felt toward this child who had appeared at the edge of tragedy and had stayed not out of obligation but out of some deeper instinct. And as the girl clutched the blanket Jonathan had given her days earlier, curling into the chair beside Daniel's bed as if she finally had a corner of the world where she was safe, Jonathan sat back and let the truth wash over him that his life was no longer neatly divided between empire and home, between control and loss, for now a third piece had entered quietly, filling cracks he hadn't known were still bleeding, And as the machines hummed and Daniel drifted back to sleep with the girl's hand still resting over his, Jonathan realized that this gentle bond forming between them was weaving something fragile yet powerful, a bond that would change everything he thought he knew about love, family, and destiny. Jonathan had thought the hardest part was over, that once Daniel's pulse steadied and his smile returned, the world might let him breathe again. Yet what filled the silence of his days now was not relief, but questions circling like restless birds, and at the center of every question was Lily, the small stranger who had become anything but a stranger, the girl who had slipped so seamlessly into Daniel's orbit that the boy seemed calmer, braver, happier whenever she was near, and Jonathan could not deny the way his own heart softened when her blue eyes lifted toward him as if he were more than a man passing through her life. More than a billionaire who provided food, warmth, and walls to protect her. She looked at him as though he were something permanent, something hers, and that gaze both unsettled and warmed him in ways he could not explain. So one evening, as Daniel finally drifted into an untroubled sleep, Jonathan sat beside Lily with a gentleness foreign to his business-hardened hands and asked her, not sternly but with aching curiosity, "Where are your parents, Lily? Who takes care of you?" And for a heartbeat he thought she might finally tell him, her lips parted, her eyes shimmering as if a dam had cracked, but then she shook her head, her voice fragile and small, whispering only, I don't have anyone, just Lily." And though the words were simple, the weight behind them was unbearable, as though I carried nights of hunger, days of loneliness, and years of silence, and Jonathan felt an ache deep in his chest. For no child should define themselves by absence, no child should carry their name as their only anchor. And though he longed to press further, to demand the truth, he stopped himself, for the look in her eyes told him that whatever she had lived through, the scars still bled, and forcing them open would do more harm than good. Yet his mind refused to rest, and as he walked through the corridors of his estate the next day, still turning her words over, he noticed his housekeeper, Mrs. Alcott, frozen at the threshold of the drawing room where Lily and Daniel were coloring on the floor, and the shock etched on her face jolted him, for she was a woman who had served his family for decades, seen fortune rise and tragedy strike without flinching, but now her hands trembled against the doorframe, her eyes wide with disbelief as she whispered, "Sir, she looks exactly like Evelyn when she was a child." And the name struck Jonathan like a blade, for Evelyn was not merely a memory, she was the ghost of every tenderness he had buried, the wife whose laughter had once filled these same halls, whose absence had left them hollow, and the thought that Lily might carry her reflection was too much, too cruel, so he waved the words away, insisting it was imagination, a trick of grief. Yet even as he dismissed it, he couldn't silence the image of Evelyn as a girl, a photograph once tucked into his wallet, the same tilt of the chin, the same spark in the eyes that seemed far too much for coincidence. And as the days passed he found himself watching Lily more closely, tracing the shape of her smile, the way she frowned in concentration, the way she tilted her head when listening, and each time a wave of déjà vu swept over him, stirring memories he thought had died with Evelyn. And still he fought it, telling himself that grief made liars of the heart, that the mind invented echoes when the soul longed for what it had lost. Yet one night when rain lashed against the windows and he carried Lily upstairs after she had fallen asleep with her head on Daniel's shoulder, he caught the faint scent of lavender in her hair, the same fragrance Evelyn had once worn, and he paused in the hall, unable to move, staring at the sleeping child who felt too familiar, too entwined with a past he could not untangle. And as he laid her in bed and drew the blanket over her small frame, her hand reached instinctively to grasp his, holding tight even in sleep, and in that moment the denial crumbled, replaced not by certainty but by a haunting question that refused to leave him. Who was Lily really, and why did every piece of her presence feel less like chance and more like destiny trying to speak? Jonathan's body trembled as he sank into the hospital chair, the sterile beeping of monitors surrounding him like a constant reminder of how fragile life could be. His tailored suit wrinkled and forgotten, his tie hanging loose as if his empire no longer mattered, only the two fragile souls before him. He reached out with both hands, clasping Daniel's small palm in one and Lily's delicate fingers in the other, And in that moment, he was not the billionaire who owned glass towers or the ruthless CEO feared in boardrooms. He was simply a man stripped of pride, stripped of power, stripped down to the raw core of a father who had almost lost everything without ever realizing he had already been losing for years. And as tears fell unashamedly down his cheeks, he whispered in a cracked voice that bled sincerity, "I failed you once. I failed to see, to know, to protect, but never again will I let go. Never again will I let this world take from me what matters most. You're both my children, my family, my reason to breathe," his words shaking as if spoken not just to Daniel and Lily, but to Evelyn's memory lingering in the air, the ghost of the woman he had loved and lost. And in the soft, dim light, Daniel stirred faintly, his lips curling into the smallest, weakest smile, his voice fragile yet laced with trust as he whispered, "Dad, you kept me safe." And Jonathan's chest cracked open with a surge of both pride and guilt, while Lily, clutching his other hand tightly, leaned closer, her golden hair spilling across the white hospital sheets, her tear-filled eyes shimmering with a depth no child should have to carry, and she breathed words that shattered and rebuilt him all at once. "I knew you'd come for me one day, Daddy." And Jonathan, unable to hold back, pulled her carefully into his embrace beside Daniel, the three of them bound together in a knot of grief, love, and rebirth. And for the first time since Evelyn's death, he felt whole, not because of wealth or towers or empires, but because family had returned to him in the form of two tiny hands and one sacred truth. And as the night stretched on, he made silent promises to Evelyn, to Daniel, to Lily, that boardrooms could wait, profits could fade, empires could crumble, but he would rise each day not for power but for bedtime stories, for shared laughter, for scraped knees, for the simple joy of tucking his children in. And though the city outside sparkled with lights competing against the stars, inside that small hospital room, the brightest light was the fragile bond mended and reborn. A bond that would never again be broken. A bond that turned a billionaire into something far rarer, far richer. A father who finally understood that true wealth was not counted in millions, but in moments, in second chances, in family found against all odds.